Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we've got a packed house. We've got the professor, Brian Santana. Brian is the author of A Murder on Campus, a professor, the cop, and North Carolina's most notorious cold case. If you like Brian after the show and you want more of him, you can visit his website. It's www.briansantanaauthor.com. And we've got, of course, today with us my co-host, Allie Siebert. She is an author and historian. Her book out now is Bloodstain, which is available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. If you caught our last show, we actually did one on this book, The Mysterious Miss White. You can also pick that up and make sure you catch that show. And lastly, Allie has her own show, Allie in the Archives. This is something very unique. She takes old historic cases from the 1900s and adds music, and it's a very interesting storytelling type of vibe. Please check it out. It's available anywhere you can get a podcast, Apple, Spotify, you name it. Welcome, Allie and Brian. How's everyone doing tonight? So tonight, Brian, we're going to be talking about one of the stories in the book. For those that are not aware, A Murder on Campus is about the murder of Virginia Olson, who was a student at UNC-Asheville in 1973. And throughout the investigation, cases popped up that were similar to the murder, and investigators did not know if the person responsible for those other murders were linked to the murder of Virginia. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Brian, tell us about this case.
So, I'm glad to be here again. It's nice to team up with you again and revisit this case that was a big discovery for us when we were researching, I know. And I mentioned to you before, I think this is the first time this case has ever been talked about on the air. So I'm delighted to talk about the 1978 murder of Mary Burdette. So this is another murder that is going to take place 5 years after Virginia Olson's murder on the UNCA campus. And it takes place 5 years after Olson's murder. But as you mentioned, it's one of a string of murders that we talk about in the book that seem to have connections to the Olson case and which confounded investigators very early on who were working to put together a narrative. So when the Virginia Olson murder investigation stalls out at the end of year one, they really start looking both outside of the state of North Carolina and within the state to other possible connections to different cases. And while they are doing so, other cases that had either similar MOs or some more direct connection to UNC-Asheville campus continue to pop up. And they're not really sure what to do with these. And this is one of them. So this is a murder that is going to take place actually in the Botanical Gardens, where Virginia Olson was murdered, and occur roughly 5 feet from where her body was found.
So, Brian, I know that the Virginia Olson case got very little coverage. How much coverage do you think this got compared to the Olson case?
A lot less. So this was, the Olson case really had, it had a lot of coverage very early on, but then it quickly dissipated. But this case had even less. So there's only around 6 or 7 articles that are written right after this murder occurred. And we can get into this, as we talk through it. But part of this, I think, has to do something with Mary Burdette as a person, a victim who is not going to necessarily be someone who would kind of conventionally get the public's interest. She was poor. She was not white. She was living on Social Security at the time she died, and she was 60 years old. So it's there were a lot of different things that kind of worked against her, but there was some coverage. The trial that will ultimately result from this is one that's going to get substantially more coverage than her as a person, or or the murder early on itself.
So, Brian, can we start at when the body was discovered?
Yeah, so to put this into context, so this murder occurs in, see, body found in wooded area, and this is the way she is going to be referred to as a while. They refer to her as the kind of the body, the woman who's found near UNCA. There is early on some difficulty identifying her, but to give you your listeners and viewers some context, so in 1978, when this murder occurs, when Mary Burdette is found, this is the first class that's starting that fall that had not been around when the Olson murder happened. So Virginia Olson's murdered in April 1973. People that started off as freshmen with Virginia Olson had just graduated. So there were these events that we talk about in the book that plagued the campus for 4 years. This was essentially a new reset. This was a new class that was coming in that did not have that direct connection to Olson or the kidnapping that happens on campus a year later or some of these major events. So the campus largely had kind of started to kind of move on in the sense that there had not been a major, at least, news story surrounding violence on campus in 4 years, and many of Olson's friends who were speaking actively to the press had graduated and moved out of state to other places. But on the week this event occurred, it was actually a big one on campus. So UNC-Asheville's political science department was hosting a major political debate. This is the 11th congressional district, and between a guy named Lamar Gudger and Curtis Ratcliffe. And so they wanted to mimic the kind of televised debates that we got in 1976 with Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And so there was a lot more attention on the campus over the course of this week because they were hosting this major political debate. And on Wednesday, October 11th, this is around 10:30 in the morning. Some workers from Southern Bell, which is a telephone company in North Carolina, they were kind of moving through the Botanical Gardens woods en route to an area to set up some new telephone lines, and they came across a body of a woman. And so that's kind of where the story initially begins. There we go. Body of a woman found near UNCA's campus. Something is important to point out, I think, with this article is that notice how UNCA is foregrounded, is found near UNCA. A central thing we talked about with the Olson book was the idea that the campus tried to distance itself from its connections to the Botanical Gardens. But after a few years, and once this murder happens, UNCA's name is going to be on the coverage for this story, and this murder is also going to be associated with the campus.
So, first of all, Allie, I assume that you've not heard about this case at all.
I have not, but I'm glad to be hearing about it now. I find it really interesting that you mentioned that she was referred to as just a body found for a long time, because that's such an important point to make when a victim isn't like when it's not quote unquote like sexy. It's not going to get the coverage that somebody else might. When it's a young woman who's pretty and popular and all of that, that's going to get so much coverage. But a woman who's poor and in her 60s, it's not going to be as it's interesting. I don't know if that's the right word to the general public, but I think that that's such an important point to make. So I'm glad you did.
Yeah,
There's really been a picture. Mm-hmm.
I know that we see that so many times with serial killers because they know to prey on these women and they know that they're not getting the attention and the press that they should. And you see that time after time again. We've covered plenty of cases on the show where, they target prostitutes and they know that the police are not going to put as much of effort into the case. But we're lucky that Asheville, they did in this case. Their lead detective, who was a lieutenant at the time, did a fabulous job, and he had a reputation for being a go-getter. And I think that's something that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So the body is found, Brian, and the police start the investigation. Are they getting any leads right away, or is this case going cold?
Not right away. It was difficult. So a guy named Walter Gilchrist is the first officer from the Asheville Police Department on the scene. And in the actual reports in his report tied to this, he just wrote that he had found a woman lying on her left side, facing east, with both legs together. He noted that the woman's pocketbook had been recovered near her body, but it didn't contain any information that would allow police to identify her. He did note and describe her as a, quote, dark-skinned woman with dark hair, streaked with gray and small in stature. And so there wasn't really a lot to go on just in terms of identifying her, particularly because she is going to, there was some confusion even early on about how she died. So one of the things that kind of brought the officers that were initially on the scene, they noted in their report that it appeared that her throat had been slashed. And they also believed, based on the context and the location, this area that was known as a haven for winos and as a kind of lover's lane, that they speculated that she'd been sexually assaulted as well. But they didn't know who she was, and they're going to have to kind of recalculate how they're approaching the investigation once the medical examiner's report is going to come back a few days later.
And so what did the medical examiner's report? What information were we able to gather from that?
So the medical examiner determined, to the surprise of the officers who were on the scene, that Mary Burdette had died by strangulation and not stabbing. Her body had apparently been decomposing outdoors long enough that the area surrounding her neck had decayed, and the officers thought that her throat had been cut, but apparently that was not the case. She had been raped, or she had. This is going to come up at the trial as a point of contention. She had sex. And she had been that she had been strangled, though, was her actual cause of death. Now, the reason that this matters is because Olson was sexually assaulted. She was found 5 feet from the spot that Olson was murdered. And so some of these police officers that are on the scene, the officers from the SBI, they had also worked the Olson scene. So they were familiar with this crime scene. And so you can imagine someone that looks like they've been sexually assaulted, who appears, at least early on, to have her throat cut. They're starting early on to ask questions about a possible connection. But yeah, it does change the calculation a little bit when they discover that she was strangled and not stabbed. And it was just decomposition that they were physically observing.
How long had she been there? How long had the body been just waiting?
I don't have an exact amount of time. I know it had been unseasonably warm that fall. She had been out there for at least a few weeks, though, because the suspect that we're going to learn ended up making a few trips to visit her body, and is going to kind of mutilate her body a little bit. When we get to him, and so she had been out there long enough for advanced decomposition to set in, combined with the environmental factors, and also for this very strange man who is responsible for her murder and is ultimately convicted to visit her on more than one occasion after her death.
So what led police to the suspect in this case?
So there's a few different things that kind of are going to bring the main suspect, this guy, Richard Levi Jenkins on to the attention of police. But I wonder if before we get to even Richard Levi Jenkins, though, maybe it's worth pointing out that, you know, we said it was a few days before the after the medical examiner's report. It was around this time they were able to identify who she was as well. So she went from the body or the dark-skinned woman to Mary Faye Burdette. And I think, to go to like Allie's point, I think it's an interesting one to consider, because one of the amazing things I think about this case is that I think a lot of times that police will catch a lot of flack for not necessarily, you know, there's accusations sometimes that people from, and in some cases it seems to be true, but like people from lower socioeconomic brackets or people who are non-white will sometimes receive less investigative resources or less care and attention. And if that's the kind of framework you're coming at this case from, then you would expect this to be an investigation that they put no work into, because this is a 60-year-old woman who was single. When living as a single woman was exceedingly difficult financially. She primarily subsisted off of Social Security checks. She had very few living relatives aside from her biological children, who were not especially close to her. She was known by associates as someone who kind of dreamed of stability in her life and craved kind of meaningful romantic connections. And because of that, she often kind of looked for love in the wrong place, I guess would be the way to put it, and ended up with characters that she shouldn't have, like Richard Levi Jenkins, the main perpetrator in this case. But at the time of her death, she had lived in Asheville for around 6 years. She had come from Georgia before that, and she didn't really have a robust support system. So unlike Virginia Olsen or Karen McDonald and other people we kind of talk about, it makes sense that there was a big investigative presence with those. But one of the things that was a real pleasant surprise with this was both the North Carolina SBI and the Asheville Police Department worked really fast in this case and poured in a lot of resources. And so this is one of those cases where, if you're looking for a really good example of thorough police work, this is one. And that was surprising, because you wouldn't necessarily imagine, if you're coming at this from the perspective that they're going to put less resources into a person like Mary Burdette. And that just wasn't true here.
Why do you think that was?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I'd have to speculate. I think that at least some of this, if I had to speculate, I think the connection to Olsen probably helped early on, because if you read the early articles, at least, and I know that, you know, they mentioned UNCA, Virginia Olsen is talked about frequently in those early articles. I was just glancing at one just a moment ago. So the Asheville Citizen-Times, the day after, actually writes, it acknowledges this body of a woman was found, but then it goes into a 2-paragraph long discussion about Virginia Olsen. So, and the author, Billy Pritchard, writes, the body was found close to where a 19-year-old UNCA co-ed Virginia Marie Olsen was found, bound, gagged, and stabbed to death on a Sunday afternoon more than 5 years ago, and goes on to talk about Virginia Olsen. And so I think there was at least some idea that if there was a connection to Virginia Olsen, then it was really important to solve this case. Maybe that's the cynical view of the entire thing. But we also had a guy that Cameron mentioned in Will Anarino, who is a young detective. He's only a lieutenant at this point. 6 years from this case, this is one of his early cases. He's going to become a very young chief of detectives and lead the Olsen investigation again in the 1980s. And so, yeah, he had trained at the FBI's, academy and some special workshops, and was really seeking out every opportunity possible to kind of become a better investigator. So I think that it also made a difference because it was led by him. Mm-hmm.
You know, I think would made a really big difference too is that in 1973 in North Carolina, that's when training and standards started, and professional police training really began. And so you've got that happening right when Virginia Olsen is murdered. And there's a lot of mistakes. I think that's fair to say. In that investigation, the police made tons of mistakes, and you can read about it in our book. But with that being said, now you've got this other murder that happens, and you've also got Anarino who comes in, who's had that professional training, and I'm sure that he's looked through the Virginia Olsen case and noticed how many things, they should have done differently, like setting up a crime scene, making sure you're processing evidence correctly, interviewing and canvassing for witnesses, and making sure all that's documented and organized. That didn't happen in the Virginia Olsen case. But now you've got people that really understand that importance. And it seems so simple to say that. But when we look at cases around that time, it just didn't happen.
Mhm.
So, Brian,
Hmm.
I think that when we're looking at this and now we know who she is, we've got the SBI, which is the State Bureau of Investigations, and we've also got Asheville police working together. And it sounds like they are actively working this case or getting some witnesses. Do they stumble upon a suspect? How does this happen? Does someone come forward?
Yeah, so they start to Anarino goes to work right away, putting together a timeline, and he's interviewing a lot of different people. And he's early on, he's not entirely sure that his timeline is correct, but he does start to develop a working hypothesis. The one witness says the last time they saw Mary Burdette alive was October 4th, 1978. So this is roughly a week before the discovery of her body. Now, how the extent to which, given the state of decomposition, going to Allie's earlier question, is that actually correct? I don't know. But at least early on, he's working under assumption she's last seen around October 4th, a week before. And he interviews this witness who spotted her exiting a taxi cab near the botanical gardens. And this is going to lead him to question several of the taxi drivers, and who are going to ultimately help him to identify the man who shared a taxi ride with her. And some of the taxi drivers are going to have some very disturbing stories about that experience. But going back to that point that Allie had made about like why this case was attracting so much attention, I was just looking back through some notes, and a guy named J.N. Mentor, who's the head of the SBI's Western office, one of the things he acknowledged the difficulties with the Mary Burdette case because they didn't really have a lot to go on. A lot of times, Cameron, you talk about like the victimology and looking at that,
Right.
who are the people in this person's life, and kind of investigators starting there. Well, what do you do with someone who doesn't really have family, doesn't really have a lot of really close relationships and connections, and is an older single woman, right? Like that's who's not native to that area. And so it's a really hard thing to put together. But J.N. Mentor, who's the head of the Western office, he does say this. He says, I would like to say, if we clear the Burdette case, then we can clear that one. And he was referring to the Olsen case. And so I think that this was because maybe some of the overlaps of where the body was found, and some of the kind of imagined connections, at least early on, to the Olsen case. The Olsen case had stalled out by 1978. It's going to be 3 years before we have another significant lead in the Olsen case at this point. And so maybe there was at least some idea that we couldn't solve the Olsen one, but we're going to get this one right. We're back here at the Botanical Gardens again. Bill Matthews and some of these SBI officers who worked the Olsen case, they're also working this case. And so people that were at both crime scenes, I just refuse to believe that didn't feel like deja vu, standing in the same spot.
What I was thinking about too? I wonder
Uh-huh.
how the faculty and the admin at UNC-Asheville are feeling about this, because one of the things we talked about in the book is about when Virginia is murdered. They're kind of lost about what to do. I mean, they don't have an actual police force on campus, which is a thing of pride for them. And, it's a very safe area. So they didn't feel the need. And I'm sure that they probably thought Virginia was a one-off, like, oh, this just happened this one time. This isn't going to happen again. And now they find a body almost to the exact spot of where Virginia is. And that makes me question too, like, why would you pick that spot? What's about that area that's so appealing?
Yeah, it's weird. Unless it's just, I mean, we talked about with the Olson case, just that connection that it was like a lover's lane area. I mean, the guy who's going to emerge as the suspect, he's going to tell some pretty crazy stories about what he thinks happened that night. But it seems to all be rooted, at least in his own version of events, which I know we'll get to, in consensual sex. And so I don't know if it was just a connection to the lover's lane, but it's hard for me to imagine how this area, after Olson's rape and murder in this area, how anyone would imagine this is a romantic spot at that
Right.
point. You would think that had kind of spoiled whatever kind of associations it had before.
Allie, what's your take on that? Do you think that sounds like a romantic spot to, for a guy to take you where a girl was murdered a couple years ago?
I mean, me personally, no. Are there people out there who I think might be enticed by that kind of thing? Absolutely. So maybe it was more of like a I don't know, like a interesting place to go for people like that.
Yeah, I mean, me and Brian wanted to visit that spot, but the chancellor's office his house is actually was built on that location, so you actually can't
Oh.
visit that anymore. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, that seemed just kind of odd to me that within 5 feet you find an unrelated murder. Unless that is just a perfect secluded spot that may be a popular destination for people in the area.
And this is
So
one of the weird things, I think, because it's like, yeah, I mean, because of the proximity, it seems like too much of a coincidence. Where it's like the thing with with Karen Olson. It's like on the anniversary of Olson's murder, 1 year anniversary. We talk about in the book. There's another UNCA student is kidnapped in the midst of the celebration and stuff. Like that's crazy.
Mm.
And you would imagine there has to be some kind of connection to what's going on. And even though police by this point, they are firmly locked in on John Rivas Jr. and try as a principal suspect in the Olson case, they're kind of forced, like you said, to look at this to look at this guy that they apprehend, because it just does seem like a very weird coincidence, especially for those first few days when the investigation is going to be really heated and they're going to be kind of really out there working in full force with the SBI. When they're working under the assumption that she had also been raped and her throat cut.
okay, so let's get back to it. So she's now identified. We know who she is. We really don't know a lot about her, but we saw her getting out of this taxi cab near the location where she was murdered. Where do we go from there?
So Anarino is going to question some of the taxi cab drivers, and they are going to try to find who this guy was. They get a description very early on of the man who had accompanied her, and eventually another taxi cab driver is going to come forward with a pretty incredible story. And he is going to describe that he had someone who he had, it was not the same taxi cab driver as the night of the actual murder, but that he drove this guy who did ask to go to the botanical gardens, who was a little strange. And when he waited for him, and when he came back out of the woods, he had blood on his clothing. And that's a very weird occurrence. And he is going to pass this tip along to the Asheville police. And This is going to be, of course, obviously suspicious enough that they are going to take a look at this guy. And the guy is named Richard Levi Jenkins. And when they look a little bit more into his record, there's going to be lots of red flags. And so, very early on, they are going to hone their focus in on him.
What are some of those red flags?
Well, the first is he had a prior history of mental illness, but also rapes as well. Um, he had been associated with rape since 1969, was actually the first allegation made against him. In March of 1969, he had been arrested and was charged with assault with intent to rape. And he had spent 2 years in psychiatric care as part of his sentence for these particular crimes. And so they're looking at, given the fact that Burdette had been strangled, raped, and what the police called sexually mutilated, which we could talk about.
So, Brian, when he was spending time at the psychiatric hospital, that was at Dorothea Dix, correct?
Yeah, so he had spent time at Dorothea Dix, and when he's ultimately arrested, he's going to be spend more time getting evaluated at Dorothea Dix as well. A bit about Richard Levi Jenkins, though. He was 5'8", 165 pounds is the way that they describe him in the report. He had medium length blonde hair. He had very thick glasses, and he was slightly cross-eyed. So he was someone who had spent his life as he was unemployed at the time of Burdette's murder, but he had been a kind of itinerant crop picker on and off for his life in between the time when he was out trying to commit sexual assaults and rapes.
So, Allie, you've done a lot of really old cases. Have you ever done any research into psychiatric hospitals? Do you have any cases with those?
I
Have
have
you
quite a
visited
few.
any of them?
Yes-ish. Uh, I have, but most of them aren't still functioning. So it's tough. And a lot of the cases I work on are really old. So, 1800s and that sort of thing. And things just, they're not the same as they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But it's it's interesting that you say that because I know for me, when I hear psychiatric hospital, my mind immediately goes to, borderline abuse of patients and terrible conditions and, that sort of thing, not helping the patient, but instead exacerbating the issue and making things worse. In the 70s, was it like that as well?
So I've been to Dorothea Dix Hospital when it was uh, working, or when it was still functioning as a hospital. They've closed it down. And at the time, back in the early 2000s, Dorothea Dix was a hospital that you went to if you did not have insurance. And it was
Mm.
very old. It was a huge campus with these brick buildings, and they had some of the buildings where their sole purpose was just to house people that had murdered people, and they're never getting out,
Yeah.
including, I believe one of the serial killers, her name was the Black Widow. She was a female that killed a bunch of guys. She was housed
Mm.
there. But that place was so creepy. I've always told people you would not have to dress it up at all. Just allow people to walk through the halls during Halloween with the lights on. It'll still scare them.
Yeah, I believe it. And so can you imagine being a patient there?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the things that we talked about in our book was the hospital in Asheville, where, it's a mental hospital, and the types of treatments they were giving them, like, giving them insulin until they had a coma, or electroshock therapy. But of course, a lot of these people would advertise it more as less or as almost like a resort type of thing. Like, oh, you're going to come there and you're going to get fresh air and go hiking and, don't worry about the guy screaming in the basement because he's being
Yes.
electrocuted.
Yeah. It's
So, yeah,
so it's so tough with that kind of thing because it's it's like it's hard to blame them when you first look at it because I am certain that most of the people who were there who were inflicting these kinds of treatments weren't intending to cause problems. I think that most of them believed that it actually did help.
right.
Um, and I'm sure that there are people who were putting people into insulin triggered comas because it was easier than dealing with the actual patient. But for the most part, I think that there were people out there who wanted to help and wanted to make a difference. But looking back on it now through a modern lens, it's horrifying to consider that this is how we treated people with mental illnesses. And, the further back you go, the more horrifying it gets.
Right. And I completely agree. And the other aspect that I've kind of seen is some people you just can't help. Another person we talked about in our book is a call that I went to. It was a 911 hang up call where I was the first person to get there, and we get these calls all the time. And it's at this apartment complex near Wake Med. It's on the 3rd floor, and I go there, and luckily my partner was with me at the time, and I knocked on the door, and the guy opened up the door a couple inches and stuck his face in the door and said, "Are you the police?" And, it'd been one of those days where we hadn't done anything. I'm about to get off, just got a few hours. And I was like, yeah, I'm wearing a Raleigh police uniform, and opens up the door. And he's this large black man with a big afro, but his skin around his neck is gray. And it looks like someone cut out like a watermelon slice from his neck. And you can see everything. It looks like a Halloween mask
Oh
because
my
there's no
god.
blood coming out, and there's no blood on him. And I was just kind of staring at him and really in shock. And finally, my partner just blurts out, "Dude, what the fuck's the matter with your neck?"
Uh-huh.
And he goes, "Yeah, I was gonna tell you about that. Uh, I killed my girlfriend last night, and then I tried to kill myself."
Oh my god.
And
Ugh.
it took me a second, and I grabbed his wrist and I flipped it around into a bent wrist to put on handcuffs. And I looked down, and he's got an orange wedge missing from his wrist. Like, you can see all the
Oh
way
my
down.
god.
It does not look real, but I know I
And
cannot
he's
put a
just
handcuff
calm?
on this. Completely
Yeah.
calm. And he's a
Mm,
big guy too. And so I
yeah.
grabbed him by his shoulder and guided him to the ground, gave him a quick search, and I looked him dead in the eyes and I said, "Are you sure she's dead?" And he just looked at me really just matter of fact and goes, "Yeah, I'm sure she's dead." And I asked him, "Okay, where's she at?" He goes, "She's in the back bedroom." And so I tell Kyle, said, "Hey, are you good with him?" And he's like, "Yeah, go." And as soon as I step into the apartment, there's just blood, like a huge blood trail. And
Mm.
the lights are off. I've got a little flashlight, like a tack light with me, got my pistol out, and I'm starting to clear the apartment. And in the back room, I see an object, I guess you could call it, with a blanket on top of it. All the lights are out. So the only thing that's illuminating it is my flashlight. And I pull the blanket off, and her head is hanging on by like a thread.
Oh, God.
So we lock it down. And of course, EMS is called.
Mm.
And we later learned that he got out of Holly Hill, which is our mental institution, that night, got in an argument with his girlfriend, stabbed her like 60 something times
Mm.
to the point that he actually took a break because he was tired of stabbing her. And then he decided to take a shower and kill himself in the shower. And somehow, after slicing his neck and his wrist, he failed and did not, complete the mission. But then after the shower, he, I guess, got over the guilt part. And so he sat down, ate a bowl of cereal, took a nap, and then called the police.
Hmm.
You know what's another fun
Yeah,
fact
see,
about this?
uh,
He gets out
Another
of
fun fact is
prison next year in 2026.
I was going to ask you if you had checked on that. Another fun fact about that story is it traumatized me when I heard it. That was one I had never heard before. And it was one of many moments when we were writing this book where I was like, what the fuck? That's what you were doing for your job the entire
yeah.
time?
Yeah.
All these years? I was
No
thinking back to all
kidding.
these years, like, what was roughly going on in my life when we were like talking at that point that your nightly, that I didn't hear about at the time, that your nightly call was like someone's head kind of, like,
Oh my
completely severed
God.
like that. And I thought about that a lot since then, more than I care to admit. And I think that one of the things that is really interesting to me was there's this moment in the book or early on where Cameron says something the equivalent of like, and that's like the life of the beat cop. You go to the craziest shit you've ever seen, and then you kind of go out and you do it again at the next call. And that was one of those that kind of mesmerized me because I can't
Yeah.
imagine doing that. So.
There's so many layers to this here because, like, to start, I can't imagine how that affected you, Cam, because that, like, I know, I'm sure that you saw stuff like that more times than you can count, but that's got to have a huge effect on your emotional stability, your mental stability. But aside from that, I mean, like you said that he had gotten out of where he was, whatever hospital, whatever
Yeah,
treatment center he was at. Did he, like, escape or was he
no, he
released?
was released.
And see, that's where my issue comes in is that, like, we know that this man has mental issues. We know that he's struggling. We know that he needs support. Why are we letting him out? Why aren't we supporting this man? Why are we, not protecting people in his life when we know that he's not stable for this?
Well, the problem that happens with people like this, and he's just one of many, is that when they're in and out of the institutions, they've got a threshold of they have to be a danger to themselves or others. And then once they say the right things, then they're usually released and told, like, okay, we're going to set up some outpatient therapy that you're not going to go to. Right. And, or, you just take this magic pill and everything will be fine, except for when you don't take the magic pill. And that's what you kind of see
Yeah.
time and time again. It's either they don't take the magic pill or they find their own, like a better magic pill or like crack to
Yeah.
replace that because it's cheaper than getting the prescription and it's a better high for them.
Yeah.
And so there's all these dynamics that are happening. And when we look at a case like this, where we've got a guy that's walking around Asheville and he's really like I know it's very cliche, but he's just a time bomb. He's going to do
Yeah.
something really dangerous. It's a matter of time.
Yeah. And that's my issue is like like, obviously, he did a horrible thing, and I'm not saying that that's condonable or anything like that, but, you know, we created a system where he's able to do that. And at the end of the day, that's who's at fault is the system itself, because there should have been protection. There should have been this shouldn't have been allowed to happen.
Yeah, and with this, I mean, right now, mental health is still a big issue. And I know that a lot of it too revolves around how much bed space is available at these hospitals, because that's just a debacle. And then if you're violent, you cannot go to I'll say a normal hospital. And if you're really violent, you can get what's called blacklisted, which means that that hospital will refuse to take you. And so your options become even more limited, which means that when the doctors are trying to place you somewhere and they know that it's going to be extremely difficult to get you to that, that hospital that's 3 hours away, because that's something that happens in North Carolina, where you may be picked up in Raleigh, but you're driven to Butner, which is, an hour or two away from Raleigh. Or there's a hospital near the beach and there's a hospital near the mountains. And where you go depends on who has a bed available. And
Which
so
is fucked
it's a
up to
very
me.
big logistical nightmare that they're dealing with. And when you think about in 1978, that's got to be even a bigger problem, right? Like, they really don't know what they're doing. They're doing these, I'll say, experimental treatments, but like with the electroshock and the other things, that they probably do believe that they're helping the patient, because that's what science is telling them is the best course of action. But, we know, looking back at it, that that's not appropriate and abusive.
Yeah. Mm. That's horrible. What a absolutely terrible story. Why would you tell that to us?
Well, I've got plenty more available if people want to check out A Murder on Campus. You can also hear about the first murder that I went to, a double homicide on the first shift that I worked. Yeah.
Strong start.
Yes.
Yeah, these are fascinating stories. If you want the perspective of what this looks like from the ground, as a and something you said too about like this is also one of these cases, like with these people who commit these crimes, it's very rarely the case that someone who has escalated to the point that they kind of rape someone or rape and murder someone, that they're going to be rehabilitated where they come out and they're never going to do this again. It just seems very unlikely. And one of the things that is going to come out at trial for Richard Levi Jenkins, just to give a spoiler jumping ahead, is that this is not the first or only rape and murder that he has committed. And so these things are going to kind of, and he's in and out of psychiatric care for much of his life from 1969 through this. And so he's every time he's out of psychiatric care, he is engaging in something that is going to become, escalate to the point that we are going to have essentially a kind of necrophilia situation with this case.
So I know we jumped to some side stories. So let's get back to the case. They figured out that it's Richard, and I put a picture up, warrant issued and murder. Can we tell us about what we know happened that night of the murder?
Well, there's some different stories that come out, but I mean, well, I'm looking at this article you just put out with the warrant arrested. So when the Anna Reno and the police kind of hone in on Richard Levi Jenkins, one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to attempt to skip town, but he's not a particularly savvy criminal. And to the FBI and Asheville Police Department's credit, they are combing bus stations and interviewing people, and they discover that he was attempting to get on a bus leaving for Knoxville, Tennessee, after like roughly a day after they've put together who he is. To put this into context, how fast law enforcement is working in this case, from the time that this murder occurs, this is it is 11 days. This is essentially 11-day investigation. We've talked about these different details. He is going to surrender to law enforcement on October 27th, 1978. And so, this warrant's going to be issued for his arrest, and they are also going to discover, because they realize very quickly he is not the brightest bulb, that he had to have some assistance in trying to leave as well. And they're also going to make an arrest for the person who attempted to aid his escape. Yep. Accessory is going to be charged as well. So James Lee Nicholson. Yeah, so this is a 32-year-old Weaverville man who was charged with accessory after the fact for concealing him at his home. That's where he had been during those days where the Asheville police and FBI were out looking for him after they identified him, and then attempted to help him get on a bus, which is not going to go well for Mr. Nicholson, and is a very ill-advised move to make.
Yeah. So the article that we put up, it's titled "Accessory Case Bond is Granted," and like Brian said, that's never a good idea to help someone that murdered someone. So he's picked up. Can we go through kind of the story of what we believed happened that night?
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you what Anarino basically has in his reports and the testimony he gives under oath at the actual trial. So Anarino, who had a kind of prodigious memory. I mean, he's quoting this at the trial, but this is also in the statements that he is going to write up associated with this case. So early on, Anarino explains that Jenkins essentially confesses to him when they picks him up that he's responsible for this murder. Now, Jenkins is going to attempt to recant that confession when they go to trial, of course, but he tells Anarino, according to Anarino, that he wanted to get this thing off his chest. And he tells him about meeting Mary Burdette for the first time at a Lexington Avenue diner in Asheville on October 4th. And so he said after spending a kind of evening having dinner with her, they decided to leave and go someplace more private. He took her to the Botanical Gardens, this secluded spot where she was ultimately found. He said once they were in the Botanical Gardens, they had consensual sex, but that after the sex, he fell asleep soon afterwards. Anarino does note in his report and in his testimony that Jenkins said that he, quote, put his hands on Burdette's neck, but that he, quote, did not remember squeezing. According to Jenkins, quote, all I know is that when I woke up, Mary was dead. So he admits to being with her in the garden that night. He admits to having sex with her. He admits to putting his hand on her neck, but he really doesn't remember squeezing, and he woke up and she was dead. So that's the story that he is going to stick to for much of this, and is going to argue that this was not a confession, but essentially he's baffled about what happened. But the people who saw Jenkins and what's going to come out of the trials, they were a little less baffled, and the story's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. So, Allie, what are your thoughts on that? That sounds like a slam dunk to me.
Yeah, it's that's tough to argue with. With the botanical gardens, can you describe like what that place looks like? Like they went there to, rendezvous. Would that have been like a good place to do that? Are they on the ground? Are they like what am I picturing here?
So this is an area that's basically slightly adjacent to the Botanical Gardens, and this is where Olson was as well. So it's basically, if you're going towards the Botanical Gardens, you could take a side path and essentially hike up to this area that is not strictly speaking within the botanical gardens, but that overlooks from a spot essentially the UNCA campus and parts of the botanical gardens as well. So it's like an elevated location. It was enough off the beaten path that it was a spot that was known to both students and locals as a spot where winos like to go drink, and also as a lover's lane for students as well prior to Olson's. But there is a kind of trail that leads up to it. There's other trails that intersect going in other directions. There is a large rock that if you're kind of perched sitting up there, you have a view of the main road. This is was it Weaverville Boulevard, and you have a main view of the road. You can see UNCA, and you can also see parts of the botanical garden as well. So it's close enough that you're within kind of earshot of the botanical gardens, and particularly on a high traffic day. But it is far enough removed that you have at least some cover of privacy in a way you typically don't with the botanical gardens, which do receive a lot of foot traffic.
Got it. Okay. That clears it up for me. Because that's what I was picturing. Like, not that you said this, this is my own fault for just, putting things together in my brain, but I was picturing like a greenhouse. I thought, like, is that like where that would happen? But okay, that makes sense. Interesting. Yeah, it sounds to me like this dude did it and he knows that he did it, and falling asleep and waking up to her dead is a really convenient sort of situation for him.
Don't forget the part about he remembered putting his hands around her neck.
Oh yeah. He did it. I mean,
Well,
like,
and this is
I don't know.
Yeah. And so Anarino, he's an experienced detective too. He's not falling for this. And so where do they go from there?
Well, there are several motions. I mean, we can imagine. I mean, Ali, maybe I'll turn this over to you just for a moment. If you're putting on your defense attorney's hat, like what's the card maybe you try to play at this moment? You got a client who's trying to recant his confession, and he looks guilty, right? I mean, this is a very vivid guilty story that he tells. Like, what cards maybe do you have to play at this point?
Well, I would immediately move to like not fit for trial, mentally unwell, that sort of thing.
And
Um,
that's
and
exactly
it
what
it
defense
sounds
attorneys would do. Yeah.
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 So that
So
prior history he had, and they're going to make the argument that he's like not competent, right? That he doesn't
Yeah.
understand what he's talking about, that he has this prior history of psychiatric treatment, of going in and out of Dorothea Dix in these places with his previous sentences. And the public defender's office is going to put a local psychiatrist from Raleigh named John Patton on the stand. And under oath, John Patton is going to claim that Jenkins is, quote, mildly retarded, to use his own words, ones that we wouldn't use today. But those are the ones he uses at trial. And he says that in his view, Jenkins doesn't even really understand the charges that are levied against him.
Mhm.
But that's where the trial is going to go next. The idea that he didn't know that he was incriminating himself, or that he didn't understand the charges against him, is one that the judge is ultimately not going to buy either. And this is going to trial. So this is going to trial on August 1st, 1979.
so at what point does it come up about him revisiting her corpse?
So this is going to come up under testimony given by a taxi driver. And so investigators were aware of this, of course, before going to trial, but this is the first time the public is going to hear about it. And this is a pretty horrific detail. So what the public is going to learn is that, according to one of the taxi drivers, that Jenkins went back to the scene of the crime at least twice, from what we know of. At least 2 times he took a taxi cab with the intent of further sexually mutilating, including like having sex with Mary Burdette's body at that point, after she had been dead for a few days. The
Mm.
one of the taxi drivers who drove Jenkins to the crime scene the second time, he is going to testify under oath at the trial that Jenkins, quote, walked out of the wooded area with blood on his shirt. And so this is going to be something that the jury, which is composed of 7 men and 5 women, the media covers reported that they were noticeably impacted, is the way it's
So
described.
I want to
Hearing this
break that down a little bit because I think I don't know if we can really emphasize how gross this is, and I'm going to try to not get demonetized by YouTube for this, but this body was not just sitting around fresh. Like the reason that he had bodily fluids on him is because when a body is out in the sun, it blows up and it starts to decompose and turn colors and gets bloated. And when you grab a person's skin, because this has happened to me before too, and they're decomposing, it comes off. It's really disgusting. This guy, I don't even want to call it sex, but whatever we want to call it, did that to that type of body. And that's why he walked out of there with blood and ooze on him.
Yeah.
And what's really crazy is we see this a lot in serial killers, is that they are so obsessed with, this body that none of that bothers them at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I would put him in the category of he can't be fixed.
Well, and it seems to me too, like, we were talking about his mental state and whether he's considered like fit for trial, whether he's, I don't know the correct term to use today, but I think a man who kills somebody and then goes back multiple times to have sex with their dead body, to me, that's enough to say, yeah, this guy isn't right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know? Like whether
You
he
definitely
knows
don't
right
want him
from
out.
wrong. What's that?
I said you definitely don't want him out walking around. Like
Right.
No.
there's not a lot of
And
evidence that he's going to be fixed at that point.
And when
yeah.
I hear of people doing those really extreme acts, one of the questions I always have is what's their real number? And what I mean by that is how many other people have they killed?
Mhm.
Because it's not going to be one.
Yeah.
We see most serial killers get arrested in their 30s and 40s. And, they're obviously a serial killer for getting or having more than 3 murders. But at the same time, is it really 3 or is it 10? Or when did this start? Did he start killing when he was a teenager? And those are kind of the interesting facts that I find about this case, because I think that even nowadays, when someone like this is arrested, they're like, great, we've got him on a murder charge. We get a conviction. All right, boom, he's locked up. We're on to the next one. They're not sitting down and saying, okay, what about this missing person? What about these prostitutes that all went missing from this area?
Yeah.
It's not very efficient to put your time and resources into those types of cases, because, when you're a cop, you're on to the next thing. Kind of like what I talked about before with the guy that, lopped off his girlfriend's head. Is, of course, I got off late that night, but, woke up the next morning, put on a fresh uniform, and went back to work.
Mm. Mm-mm-mm. And that it's interesting that you say that because the whole thing about, they get a guy or a woman on one murder charge, okay, boom, done, on to the next thing. And they're not considering whether or not things have happened previous to that, and there's other bodies that, are laying around because of this person. It's something that has happened for centuries. It's not even like a new thing. Like there's a case in not to do this, but there's a case in my book um about Michigan's possible first serial killer.
This is in
A
Bloodshed
man this is yeah, in Bloodstained, yeah.
or
Um
Bloodstained. Sorry, Bloodstained.
yeah, jeez, get it right, Cam. Come on. There's a man named Scott Mussel, who was found guilty of murdering a woman that he had enticed to Michigan under the guise of "Let's get married." He did it through matrimonial ads, so he'd post in the newspaper, "I'm looking for a wife, XYZ, come see me." People would respond, they'd come over, they'd give him their money, they'd join and be married, and then the next day he'd kill them. Um, and that was the case with the woman he killed, and that's how he was caught. But there were dozens of women who disappeared before that, and they are like, yeah, he probably did it, but we don't know. His sisters were murdered suspiciously before that. His wife died suspiciously. His sons died suspiciously. And it's like there's this trail of bodies that lead to him, but we're only focusing on the one. And it's the same thing. It's just, decades later.
One more promo in our last episode, which is going to be, well, you can actually access it now by the time we post this one. But we have Dr. Bill Kimberlin, who is the author of Watch Me Die. And the book is based on, he is studying people on death row, and he actually gets invited to watch their execution. And I wouldn't call it a friendship, but he develops a communication between a lot of famous serial killers. And he told me after the show that his next thing that is going on is he's got a serial killer that is housed in South Carolina and another in Florida that has confided in him of where other bodies are that he's murdered.
Wow.
And the police were not aware about this. Bill has contacted the FBI, and they are involved, and they are in the process of doing excavations of where the killers actually made a oil painting of where they could find the body, which I think is a very unique way of doing it.
What
But
a
yeah,
valuable thing he's doing then for their stories and their family members and all of that, because that's amazing.
yeah. So getting back to this story, the trial is going on. All these horrific facts come out in trial. Brian, what's the ultimate judge's or jury's decision on this?
Yeah, so he's going to be convicted, but it becomes before he's actually convicted, though, too. I mean, building on this conversation that you are just having, they are going to, before this trial comes to a close, Anarino is going to connect him to not one, but two other murders as well. So they are going to be following up with other charges, too. So one of the brilliant things about the investigators associated with this case, this is 1978 again, is that even after they do have this guy, they start looking really closely at other cases that seem to have a similar MO. And they were eventually able to connect him to two other murders. Now, maybe there's others, but he's officially ultimately charged and then convicted, not only of this murder, but also of the murder of Virginia, of killing Virginia Ruth Higgins Mitchell and Gloria Gosnell as well, who were two other kind of older women who he had engaged in a kind of similar act with. He had raped and also strangled them as well. And so I think we talked about that there was a kind of a thoroughness that's associated with the kind of work that they're doing in this case. And this is just kind of further examples of this. So they really have they really have Richard Levi Jenkins' number in this case, and they kind of were able to solve 3 cases by the conclusion of his trial and attach him. So um, so yeah, so he's going to be convicted of first degree murder and a variety of other charges tied to mutilating the body and other things as well. And so he is going to spend the rest of his life before his death in prison.
Well, I'm glad that he died in prison, and I mean that's unfortunate that it took, 3 victims to be able to catch him. Anything else you can add about this case, Brian?
Just that, I guess, if you are interested in hearing even more details about this case, where there are some really dramatic and interesting moments at trial, I'd encourage you to pick up our book, A Murder on Campus, and take a look at it. There we go. Cameron was describing the gruesomeness of the actual scene as well, as far as what would have happened with the mutilation of the body. But one of the things that shocks the jurors is the Asheville police. They want to make sure the jury really understands this fact of how brutal this was. And so they are going to bring in pictures of the state of her body, some big color pictures that they are going to put in front of the jury to show them what this would have looked like. And there's going to be a little minor legal skirmish between the attorneys over this, but the judge is ultimately going to allow these images in. And it's a very this case provokes a lot of outrage in the community, but it does bolster a lot of goodwill towards the Asheville police. They look incredibly competent in this case, and that's not always something they're going to be able to maintain over the years, but at least at this particular moment in time, we can give credit where that is due. And this is about as good a police work as you're going to get, I think. And Will Anarino, who is our kind of hero of this story, kind of leading this first major investigation and moving very swiftly and wrapping this investigation up within just a few weeks, is going to ultimately and rightly be promoted to chief of detectives. And if you want to know what happens with someone this thorough and smart in this case, he is going to be in charge of the Olson investigation. And in the 1980s, he's going to fully reopen and activate the case. He is going to work with the FBI investigators who were originally attached to the case, and he is going to really kind of revisit who he thinks is responsible. And we unveil that individual's name in the book and talk about that whole process and kind of what collapsed with that investigation. And that investigation was not because of a lack of competence on anyone's part who was attached to it in the 1980s.
It's a very interesting case. Allie, do you have any questions about this before we wrap it up?
I mean, I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure the listeners do too. And to answer those questions, you can get the book. Just kidding. I guess because my angle, annoyingly, probably to you guys, is always kind of like the humanity aspect of it. So you mentioned that this woman, she didn't have any close friends or relationships. Her children were kind of separated from her. Do you know anything about where she was buried, or if her family kind of came back together after this and came together to support, or was there any mention of that in any newspapers or anything?
So I don't know if the word like pauper's grave will be the word that they would have used at the time, but she didn't have anyone that officially offered to pay for the funeral. So this was a kind of this would have been from like state funds, a very simple marker that she would have been given
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
time. And so she's buried in Asheville, which was the last place she lived, but not her actual home. And so the rest of her family is buried in different parts of Georgia, and so where they kind of came from, but yeah, and so it's one of these cases where there's a lot of anonymity attached to it, because while her name would kind of come up, a lot of these very strange circumstances tied to this case that are very grotesque and sensational, just describing just factually what happened with them, they're going to overshadow a lot of her. And so when we were researching this, like I couldn't even find a picture of her, and so it was incredibly difficult to find a lot of information, and so.
That breaks my heart.
Well,
That's tough.
And that's why I like having you on the show, is because you actually still have a heart, unlike me, who I'm telling stories about, ladies' heads being
Well,
chopped off, and
that'll
I
change
sleep
a
fine at
person.
night. Yeah. Um, but no, I think that really isn't stated enough. And I'll say it again. I This isn't a coincidence. I mean, he chose her for a reason, because she was lonely and didn't have family and was poor. All those just are very attractive to people like him. And unfortunately, we don't know where some of those women are still labeled as still missing, when we know that they were probably killed by someone. And when they are found, it's a simple grave, because tracking down their family is a whole, another project.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of man hours.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think it's so important to tell these kinds of stories, is because, in life and in death, these victims, they didn't get the maybe recognition or the compassion that I think that they deserved. And their stories are now just, you know, lost. They're gone and no one remembers who they are. And I think it's so important to just, keep memories like this alive, not only as just like a compassion and a outreach to these kinds of victims, but I think it's also important because it really is true that if you don't know history, you're going to repeat it. And that's the case with, all of this. It's like I work in historical crimes, and way back in the 1800s, 1700s, these same kind of things are happening. But I think if we tell these stories and we keep, putting the spotlight on these kinds of crimes, maybe something can change so that this isn't as common as it still is.
No, that's a very beautiful point to make. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you can. If you are listening to Apple or Spotify, please leave a review and give us a like. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Brian, thank you for coming on. Again, you can pick up our book, A Murder on Campus, A Professor, the Cop in North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case, at Barnes & Noble, Amazon. We also have an Audible book and a Kindle book. You can reach Brian at briansantanaauthor.com. I know he's going to be putting some articles that he's done on there. Allie, thank you again. You can get her book, Bloodstained, as well as several others that she's done, to include one that we just covered recently, The Mysterious Mrs. White. Fascinating story. And if you enjoy listening to Allie, which I'm sure we all do, please go to Allie in the Archives. That is available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you can get podcasts. Brian and Allie, thank you for joining me. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good night.
Thank you very much.